what we'll now see is a number of people piling in, hopefully. Good morning to those who are beginning to join us. We aim to start in 2 or 3 minutes. I will take you through briefly in a few minutes a little bit about Zoom for those who've not used it, and obviously give an introduction to our speaker today. So please just be patient whilst we wait for people to come in. Numbers are building quickly. We are recording the session, Stephen, which I hope is okay with you, so that those people who want to listen to it again can. We normally look to try and start our sessions as nearest to 12 o'clock as we can. I'll probably let it run 1 minute for those who are still joining and piling in, so please be patient. You still with us, Stephen?
Yes.
That's good. Not nodding off, waiting for it. We're up to 32. I think we'll wait till we get about 45. Then I'll start to begin, because whilst I talk, other people will join. We have about 80 people registered today. Normally, we get about 60 people who normally sign in out of that number of people. A lot of people register and either join late or something else comes along. So, for those of you who are now joining us, the numbers are building. I'll start to introduce Zoom to you for those who are not familiar with it. Zoom has 3 functions. The most important one is probably the Q&A menu. You'll find this on your Zoom toolbar. It's either at the bottom or the top of your screen. This allows you to write questions, and later on, those questions will be answered by Stephen. In terms of the other 2 bars that are of interest, there is a hands up bar. At any time, anyone can raise a hand. What we will do when we get to the questions, I will ask people if they'd like to verbally ask them, and do that by a show of hands. That means I can open your microphone, and I can actually bring you in also by video, which catches people out, but participation is great involvement. You also have a chat capability. The chat capability means you can speak to the panelists, which in this case is Stephen and myself, or to any other members you may know that are actually in the seminar. We're going to record the seminar today because lots of people like to listen to it again, and I'll remind you at the end that that is posted on our website. What I'm now going to do is let's get going so that we can keep it to a sharp hour. Questions you ask that are unanswered at the end, we will ensure are answered. Those will be posted online, so please keep your questions coming. So, welcome to Stephen. I'm hosting today's event, actually wearing 2 hats. I'm actually the chair of the Constructing Excellence Southwest Health and Wellbeing Group. So from my perspective, this is a really important session to listen to, and should be an important session for everyone, because there is no doubt that our current times of essentially locking down people is going to create a lot of issues around mental health and well-being for workers. So I'm now going to hand over to Stephen. So I'm looking forward to listening to you, Stephen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Howard. Good morning, everybody. So obviously, always one of the challenges with remote sessions is you don't necessarily get the immediate interaction with the audience that you're so used to when you stand up and present. So I'm going to jump into the slides. So as Howard's alluded to, we're going to look at a little bit about how the pandemic is affecting people's mental health and well-being of our workers in construction. And then we're also going to look at ways in which organizations can best plan a return to operational activity. What does that actually mean from a psychological perspective? as Howard said, any questions, let's cover those at the end, just because we've got so many people on the call. Howard, if anyone notes that they can't hear me or there are any difficulties, please ping me a note so I can make sure I either speak louder or other. So what are we going to go through? We're going to start off with a bit of context setting, a little bit about what do we actually mean by mental health. We're going to look at mental health in construction. Let's just recap. Where were we before COVID-19? Let's look about how is COVID-19 affecting our mental health of our workforce, and then let's look at considerations for returning to work. And I think importantly, how can we best support others? How can we instill a culture of psychological first aid across the industry? And how can we best keep well ourselves? Okay. All right, so what do we mean by mental health? Essentially, this is probably one of the big questions that is usually the starting question in any conversation I have with employers. Employers will quite often reach out to us and they'll say, look, could you help us address our mental health within our organization? And quite often, the question I'll be asking is, well, what is it specifically do you want to address? And sometimes it might be as simple as, well, we've got a helpline, but we're not sure people are aware of it or are using it. Or it could be, we believe we've got an issue with sickness absence relating to stress and mental health. But so very, very rarely is it looking at the sort of wider dynamic. And I think if we think about mental health, at the one end of the spectrum, it is about, in terms of addressing mental health in the workplace, at the one end of the spectrum, it is about supporting people with existing mental health conditions. At the other end of the spectrum, it is about creating environments where we better identify and mitigate drivers which can lead to mental health disorders. So simplistically, we could look at mental health in terms of three really simple areas. At the one end of the spectrum, you've got diagnosed mental health conditions which are impacting, if you like, one's perception of reality, mental illness, if you like, and they tend to be about 1 or 2% of the population. Then you've got more common mental health disorders, which is the statistic we hear a lot of, is that 1 in 4 people in any year, 1 in 6 in any week will be affected by common mental health disorder. Here we're talking about the most prevalent, of course, being anxiety and depression. And then, of course, we've got short-term distress. Of course, each and every one of us, I'm sure, around this virtual table will experience short-term distress at some point. And on the right-hand side, as a very, very crude, simplistic sort of scale, I think we also need to think about, it's about how we feel most days, as well as how we feel on a particular point in time. I may wake up this morning and may have had a particularly bad night, may have an argument with my partner, and it could set me off in a completely different direction. It could have an impact on my mental well-being for that particular day. Conversely, I could wake up and have a really, really great start to the day, get on the bike, and I'm off. So it's important to think about, am I having a lot of bad days? Am I just having occasional bad days? I think also it's worth thinking about, what influences our mental health. And I won't say what causes mental health, because we still don't really know what causes mental health problems. We know what can influence it. The model that's still very widely commonly used is George Engel's model from the 70s, which is the biopsychosocial model, which I'm sure some of you may be familiar with, which essentially looks at the various key elements or influences towards influencing a person's mental health from a biological perspective. So our genetic makeup, a physical illness we may have, a chemical breakdown in our bodies, to our social factors, so where we live, our social experience, are we isolated, are we lonely? Then of course we've got our psychological background as well, our own particular resilience levels, our levels of coping mechanisms, our friendships, our particular behaviors, for example, and then of course many will interact and cross over as well. And it's important to bear in mind it's very rarely just one factor which will cause mental health problems. And if you look at every single diagnosed mental health condition, there will be a corresponding biological, psychological, and social list of drivers or influences against each one of those particular elements. And again, also, if you look at National Institute for Clinical or National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, they break mental health conditions down into mild, moderate, and severe. Mild being, where I have some symptoms and it's having a limited effect on my daily life, through to a severe mental health problem, which is having an extreme impact on my day-to-day mental health and well-being. Let's think about where were we pre-COVID? We know our industry has a lot of issues around mental health. It goes without saying. It's one of the reasons why Mates in Mind is here. It's one of the reasons why you're on this conversation today. If we just think about some of the key stats where we were, depression and anxiety, they're accounted for around half of all work-related ill health cases. We'll touch on that one in just a minute, because of course, that's quite subjective in our industry, because a high proportion of people still aren't recording or reporting sickness absence due to mental health and well-being for said reasons. We know about a third of people, have experienced mental health disorders, issues in the past year. And if we put construction again to one side for a moment, just look at general mental well-being statistics across the UK pre-COVID, 3/4 of us, irrespective of where we worked, what we did, were noted that we felt stressed to a point where we were completely overwhelmed or couldn't cope, and that's just in the past year. So our mental well-being is a big priority, big issue, and we've got to make sure we're looking out for it. Back to the previous point, we're seeing a high proportion of people still today, much more previously, that will give a different reason for an absence related to stress and or mental health. And there'll be a variety of reasons for that. It might be I just don't feel comfortable telling my boss, I know we're talking about mental health in my business, but does that still mean I would have the conversation to say, sorry, John, I'm not coming in today because, I'm feeling a bit anxious or a bit overwhelmed? We're still not there. We've got a long way to go. So I kind of wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing. I think we've still got a lot of work needs to happen before we get to a place where we are genuinely comfortable and genuinely putting mental health on the same parity as physical health. Back to construction, 2/3 of people across construction don't feel there's enough outlets to discuss problems at work. Again, that varies from company to company. Some companies are outstanding. Some companies have done nothing yet. We know that the suicide rate in construction was already high, in fact, the highest of any industry in the UK and in most of the Western world, particularly amongst finishing trades, as high as 3.7 times national average. And also, this last point, which I've shared with many people on many occasions, it's really, really key to bear this in mind. 3/4 of the people that are dying by suicide aren't known to professional services. People are then just not reaching out for help. What's going on in here may not necessarily be something that they feel comfortable talking about, and ultimately they're taking drastic action. I don't terribly like the statement, but there is a certain amount of truth in it, in that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary, what may often be a temporary issue. But as we know, it really is quite as simple as that. Just before we move on to COVID, I think it's also worth thinking about the prevalence of people with common mental health problems that actually get help. These two tables here kind of highlight the issue. If you look on the left-hand side, the percentage of people with common mental health disorders. This is the 1 in 4 any given year, 1 in 6 any given week that face a common mental health disorder, anxiety, depression being the most common. The percentage of people that actually receive treatment, it's increasing. We're talking about mental health a lot more today than we were. We're starting to feel much more open about it. So understandably, we're in a situation where we can see why that number has increased. And I suspect if there were later figures, I would suspect that 37.3 would be higher today. Also, people that take treatment by different types of conditions as well. So particularly here, if we look at a range of anxiety and depression-related conditions, again, they vary by condition as well. I mean, it's estimated that around 3/4 of people with mental health problems just aren't getting the help that they want. I saw a statistic recently which indicated that for people with anxiety disorders that develop in adolescence, they're not really getting help until their mid-20s to mid-30s. All right, so what do we think? COVID-19, we're all in this together. This is probably the number one comment I heard since lockdown. And I came across a lovely comment last week from in The Guardian, I think it was, which I thought summed it up quite nicely. You know, we're not all in this together. You know, we're all in the same seas, and it's pretty choppy out there, but everybody's in a different boat. You know, some of those boats are very leaky. You know, some people will have existing mental health disorders. Some people will have no diagnosed disorders, but are struggling to cope with the current context. Some people, you know, some of those boats weren't given oars. You know, they might not have any support network. There's no one they can turn to. There's no one they feel comfortable talking to. Some of those boats have got high-powered motors on. Some people may have existing mental health disorders, but have good, strong coping mechanisms, have a good support infrastructure around them. And of course, you know, it's really important to bear in mind we're not all in the same boat. I do a lot of work with people that are suicidal. I work with a lot of people that have particularly anxiety and depression. And it's interesting to see the responses and the impact it's having on people with existing mental health conditions, because some people it's having a positive effect, or what they perceive as a positive effect. Because, for example, people with anxiety, some I know of are noting that, you know, there's almost this huge, great big pause button on in society, which actually helps me, and I find it less difficult to cope because I feel like I've got more breathing space. Conversely, someone else with anxiety may be complete opposite. It may make the situation a lot more difficult for them because of that lack of control. Likewise, people with depression, it can have a positive and a negative, and to some extent, it may have no little impact at all. People that are suicidal, we see a mixture of observations. Some people that have been very suicidal previously right now are less suicidal or having fewer suicidal thoughts because it's put things into context for them. Some people that are suicidal have become even more suicidal. So it's never black and white. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some of the data that's already out there. So there's a number of bodies out there that's collecting data to really closely monitor the impact of the pandemic on people's well-being. This particular one I wanted to show, admittedly it's North America, but I wanted to show because this was pretty much 1 week post-lockdown in North America, what happened across society. You know, as you can see here, you know, a very high percentage of people were very anxious, feeling very low, and a very high proportion were reporting high levels of distress, 80% reporting high levels of distress. And if you can see on the right, again, increased levels of substance use, so i.e. poor coping mechanisms. So there was a lot of uncertainty when we first went into lockdown. So that would be kind of understandable to an extent. Then let's look at UCL studies. So UCL ran a weekly study. They're on week 7 at the moment. The results of week 7 come out Friday. And they surveyed somewhere in the region of 75,000 people. And it's basically a weekly online survey, which is looking to understand the impact of the current context on people's well-being. I'll read out some of the stats from Monday's results. Basically what it's showing is depression and anxiety levels are declining slowly, but remain above average levels, as understandable. The levels remain highest in people with existing mental health diagnosis. Thoughts of self-harm or suicide are relatively stable, but they are higher amongst younger people and those living alone. Self-harm and abuse remain relatively stable as well, and they tend to be higher amongst younger adults. Overall levels of well-being are still noticeably lower than they were pre-lockdown. And again, that makes sense. Loneliness, which of course was an issue before we had this COVID lockdown, but loneliness levels are actually continuing to be relatively stable since lockdown, even amongst the high-risk groups. Exercise levels have remained constant during lockdown. Around 3/4 are reporting doing some form of physical activity. And around 3/4 of people are also in daily contact with others for at least half an hour or more a day. What we're also seeing is some genuinely good human behaviors. People are generally doing more to look out for their fellow man, which is really encouraging to see. I think this is one of those life-defining moments, isn't it? It's one of those things we look back on a couple of years and think, I feel proud for the way in which I behaved during that period of time. I looked out for people. I think that's really encouraging to see. I love the Thursday nights when we're outside and we're probably for our frontline workers in the NHS. I think this solidarity is so important. Okay, this study is interesting as well because it also asks which factors are causing them the most stress, and stress relating to COVID, catching the disease or becoming seriously ill, has continued to decrease since lockdown. Again, that kind of makes sense because I think there was a lot more uncertainty. The more certain we are, the more control we have, the less anxious we tend to be. COVID-related stress is still being reported by a greater number of people than stresses related to money, unemployment, or getting hold of food. People were also asked to complete the Patient Health Questionnaire, or the PHQ-9, which I'm sure some of you might be familiar with, as well as anxiety using the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Assessment, or the ineptly titled GAD-7. And so these are standard instruments which are used to measure levels of very light touch measurements to establish levels of anxiety and depression in a primary care setting, so in your GP setting. Simply, what it shows is depression and anxiety levels are both seeing a slight decrease, most clearly for anxiety, but overall levels are still higher than averages. So to give you an example, average levels of anxiety, people that would score negatively on the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7, for anxiety, it's normally around 2.7% of a cohort. At the moment, it's about 3.2, so it's about 0.5% higher. Depression is normally about 2.7. At the moment, it's about 3.7. So that's slightly higher levels of anxiety, slightly higher levels of depression. We've also got the ONS survey. So again, ONS since the beginning of April has started doing a lifestyle survey. And this is interesting to look at the differences in patterns from week to week. Last week, the biggest thing on people's minds was all about well-being. This week, it's not being able to make plans, which again is logical because we're starting to see some of the restrictions to be lifted, and we can see some light at the end of the tunnel. So I think it's people are now probably considering, well, can I start making plans? What about the holiday we were supposed to go on this year? Can we go and see our family? I've got friends that are ill. I need to go and visit them. So the ability to make plans is understandably the top thing on people's minds as a society. Again, that might change next week. Okay, so how do all these things affect us? So let's look at anxiety for a minute. So our nervous system's always constantly assessing the environment for safety issues and or danger. If it senses danger, our nervous system is great because it helps us focus on it to mitigate that risk. Now, it's great because it helps us keep alive. It prepares us for that imminent threat or danger. But the problem is our biggest threat at the moment is a bit of an unknown. It's a virus which at the moment doesn't really have a clear treatment path, don't really have a clear timeline for when it's going to pass, although we are seeing some good lights at that end of the tunnel. So if you like, our whole nervous system is prepared for action. It's geared up. The problem is it hasn't really got an outlet. And being in this prolonged state of heightened anxiety can cause us to make bad decisions, can make us feel isolated, it can make us go into a state of panic or freeze. So it's really, really important that we keep an eye on ourselves and keep an eye on others. So why do we get anxious? Experiencing occasional anxiety is normal. But those with anxiety disorders will often experience intense, excessive, and persistent fear and worry about everyday situations. And whilst some anxiety is natural, an anxiety disorder is that extreme form of anxiety which causes impairment. It is a very real illness. And that's really important to bear in mind. And I'm sure we all agree around this virtual table that that is the case. Anxiety disorders often involve repeated episodes of feeling intense anxiety and fear or terror, if you like, of the actual, or terror that may reach a peak within minutes or even hours, or if you like, panic attacks. And these feelings can interfere with our daily activities. They can be hard to control, and they can be out of proportion to the actual danger. Examples of anxiety disorders will include generalized anxiety disorders, or GAD, social anxiety disorders, so phobias of being outside or with people, specific phobias or separation anxiety disorders. People can quite often have more than one anxiety disorder, and sometimes anxiety results from a medical condition that will also need to be treated. Let's think about social media. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can best look out for ourselves. But I think it goes without saying, we need to take a measured intake of social media. Now, we know from the research that social media can escalate levels of anxiety more than traditional media. And that perception of risk that we have gets greater when we engage with social media over a respected news source. And we know that from a variety of different evidence studies that have been done across the past 20 years. Ones which look at civilian workers working in high risk environments, right through to survivors of the Boston bombing, through to survivors and people that were affected with SARS in 2003. The more accurate the information, the better we are able to assess things. We have more informed risk perceptions when the information comes from trusted sources. And of course, that lack of control, which we're seeing a lot at the moment, is a key contributor, driver to stress. I wanted to just put this up as one example, that association between exposure to media coverage of crisis and the impact that has on acute stress symptoms. If we take the Boston bombings, for example, in 2014, this study here was interesting because it looked at, basically showed that those people exposed to high volumes of media news around the actual event were actually at a greater risk of acute stress than those that had direct exposure to the bombings. And I believe this was 6 hours or 6 or more hours per day. And of course, we're in an environment where all of our news is 99% consumed by COVID-19 at the moment. Now, this is really important because we've got to bear in mind that ideally what we need to be doing is looking out for symptoms of early acute stressors right now. If you look at SARS back in 2003, post-traumatic stress disorder was the most prevalent psychiatric condition amongst survivors. We see a very high proportion of people that are affected by crisis, particularly with the SARS outbreak, particularly in the medical profession, where at one end of the extreme you have people that were both exposed to treating people with the condition, as well as exposed to and diagnosed and suffering with the condition, to the other end of the spectrum where you have people that have very little exposure. But every single person on that spectrum will have some degree of exposure to that threat. And that's had an impact on the development of acute stress disorders. And acute stress disorders, if untapped, if not monitored, if not supported and identified earlier on, can potentially lead to post-traumatic stress disorder down the line. I think with the SARS outbreak, they found that within healthcare workers, for example, around 30% had acute stress disorders following it, and around this was after 100 days, I should say, and then a high proportion of those also then exhibited signs of post-traumatic stress disorder later down the line. Let's just think about those symptoms of acute stress just for a moment. You've got the physical, the psychological, and the physical sort of symptoms of acute stress. And again, it's not the same for every single person. Not everybody will have these different factors. Not everyone's issues will be visible. Not everyone's issues will necessarily be visible or noticeable to themselves. For example, I find myself when I get a little bit anxious, I sometimes find myself getting a bit irritable. So it's about taking stock in myself and recognizing, oh, hang on, I know why that's happening, and then taking stock of that. But you're recognizing that it'll affect people in various different ways, from anxiety to our moods, having emotional ups and downs, to wanting to just be by yourself, to having recurrent dreams or flashbacks about particular parts. Again, avoidance is another area, and reckless or aggressive behaviors. And of course, physical symptoms as well. Stomach aches, stomach pains, heart palpitations, nausea, for example. Okay, so what are some of the key considerations in construction right now? So how is this all going to be, how is this affecting our industry? These are probably just, I'd say this is really just scratching the surface, and I think we've kind of captured, I think, some of the key points, but I'm sure each and every one of you will have other key considerations, other areas that will be at the top of your mind. But if we just go one by one, we've got right now the implication of social distancing on site. Sites are opening now. What does the implication of social distancing have on our psychological well-being? The camaraderie we normally have on site, what is that now going to look like? It'll be different. Contracts obviously will be overrunning. We're seeing some contracts, some client expectations quite clearly haven't changed. So what does that mean? The projects, the work still needs to get done within the existing time frame. Is that right? That's not for me to answer. But equally, what that means is people will be in situations where they're having to work longer hours. They'll have to be working potentially faster. We're seeing increased demands and ultimately reduced control as a result of it. Again, two big drivers to psychological ill health. We are moving into a recession, so we're going to see, obviously, the output of that, the impact on the financial stresses that people will face as a result. We know we're going to see a rise in acute stress disorders. There's not enough study yet to see the impact it's having, but we just know it's going to happen. We know from previous experience, and much more needs to happen to be able to spot those issues and put in place measures to support people. And again, a percentage of those will go on to develop post-traumatic stress symptoms. We've got to think about the impact on worker and family life. So, those people that may have been working from home are now going back into the workplace. How do we manage that transition back in? It might be that they've had to adjust to childcare issues. It might be the partner is a key worker in a hospital, for example. How do we best manage that, and how do we support our workers? Is it as simple as black and white, right? As of Monday, everyone's back. It's probably not going to be as simple as that, is it? The impact of loss and bereavement. I don't know anybody that hasn't been affected by a bereavement during this tragedy. It's how can we manage that in a workplace environment? Increased rates of suicidal thoughts. We know we're going to see an increased rate of suicide, so it's absolutely imperative that we encapsulate that and we focus on the basics of getting psychological first aid across our workplaces. So if you've not seen it already, the CIPD last week published their coronavirus returning to the workplace guide, which is really good. Some great tips in there. If we pick out on some of those key areas, regular sharing of informed and accurate information. Most of the companies that I'm working with are really good at that. We're really good at getting realistic, timely information out to our people. Thinking about how we prepare people to come back into the workplace. How do we transition from home working back into the workplace? How do we transition people that were furloughed back into the workplace? People that were furloughed, may be in a situation where they'll have reduced stamina. How do we all of a sudden go from, I've just had 6 weeks away from the workplace, or whatever that period might be, and some people will have been very productive during that time. They might have used their time to volunteer for a charity. They might have used their time to study. They might have used it to focus on other pursuits. They might have renovated their house. Some people may have just sat around and done very little. And so how do we best transition those people back into the workplace? That would be a big job. It's almost like I've just come off holiday, but actually an unplanned holiday thrown upon me, and now I'm coming back into the workplace. So that needs to be measured appropriately. Again, encouraging health, safety, and well-being. Those well-being discussions, the one-to-ones between managers and employees, both before they return as well as after, once they've returned as well. And again, having dedicated well-being focus. You're not the one-to-ones about, let's talk about what's in your workplace, what's on your plate this morning. Let's have those dedicated ones. Let's focus on you. Again, we've got to be in a position, ideally, where managers can best identify and then make adjustments. With that last point there, I think we need to remember that most people will be okay. They have good, strong coping mechanisms and are able to work their way through. There may be a number of, I don't know anyone that's not been affected in some shape or form. We're even in that world now where most of the Facebook posts that I'm seeing tend to be more honest these days. It's not about how wonderful my life is and I can take the photo of me in my garden with whatever. It's actually about, bloody hell, today my kids have done X and it's really annoying me. There seems to be much more measured, much more honesty about it, which is good. But equally, we need to be able to identify and support those people where that support is needed. I think introducing basic principles of psychological first aid, strengthening the social supports in the workplace, making it okay to talk about our well-being, making that first and foremost. Crikey, we've just coming through what is the biggest change in society since World War II. So yeah, we got to focus first and foremost on our people, on ourselves. And again, making sure we're engaging with the support services there, make sure we're engaging with HR, make sure occupational health's involved where it needs to be, understanding and making sure we know what the support services are as well, to make sure we're reinforcing those. So your employee assistance program, the Lighthouse Charity, for example, we know that there have been increased volumes of people coming through these services. I just wanted to take a quick sideline, just for 1 moment. Just before we went into lockdown, one of the things that we did with our team of occupational psychologists was look at what do we need to focus on. So if we come back to that previous point about identifying stresses so we can better help mitigate and support the early onset of longer term mental health issues, one of the key things we focused on was making sure we've got some support going out to our end supporters. So one of the things we rolled out about a month ago was our live online workshops, which are really, really critical at the moment, because again, they're about bringing people together. They're about giving people the opportunity to talk about, what's on their minds, what are their key challenges, and work those through in a group and work those through with a trained mental health practitioner. So we feel much more comfortable in knowing that actually, I know that, that things aren't great right now. I know that, we need to work together. I know how to better look out for myself, and importantly, how to look out for others. The first point there, which was a comment which was made by someone in one of the very early sessions, stood out for me, which was that, I've had ups and downs about the uncertainty, and I don't know how it's going to affect my future plans, but this helped remind me that actually I'm doing okay, and importantly, how I can help others. I think critically, it's about helping people identify issues as early as we can do so we can better mitigate them. We jump back to where we were. Okay, let's think about basic principles of psychological first aid. And if anyone wants to talk or find out more about those sessions, please do drop me an email or drop Howard an email afterwards, and we can provide you with more information. In terms of basic principles of psychological first aid, again, I'm not talking here about an official 2-day mental health first aid program. I'm just talking about, what are those basic principles of psychological first aid? Before we had mental health first aid, what did we have? And ultimately, what we're talking about here is just good human nature. This is about capitalizing on the human factor within each and every one of us. The fact within us, or the skill within us, to look out for ourselves and look out for others, and providing that immediate care and support. And basic principles of psychological first aid. Some of you may be familiar with some of the work mates of mine has done historically around things like start the conversation, so general awareness training or education programs, which again are about instilling those basic concepts of it's okay to not be okay. Importantly, we need to look out for self, and we need to look out for others, and we need to listen. We need to listen with empathy and not judgmentally. And ultimately, that's what we need to help instill within workplaces. What psychological first aid, in fact, critically, what mental health first aid is not. It is not something that just professionals do. It's not professional counselling. I have had numerous conversations where, or nightmare conversations where I've had mental health first aiders come to me and say, "Oh yes, Steve, last week I diagnosed somebody with depression, or this week I've diagnosed someone with acute anxiety." It's not a role to diagnose, and that's really, really important. First and foremost, it is that first line of defence. But critically, mental health first aid should not be over-relied on. Mental health first aid becomes a really important part of a wider support infrastructure. But critically, if we think logically, the most important part of our support structure within any workplace is each and every one of you. It's each and every one of the people you work with. So instilling basic concepts of psychological first aid is critical as part of any mental health awareness, mental health program within the business. Okay, so we're going to close off on a couple of themes before we move into the questions. So just to leave you with a couple of key thoughts and observations. So how do we better identify issues and support other people? Firstly, we've got to understand what's on people's minds. Understand gaps in someone's routine. Critically, listening with empathy, not with sympathy, and listening non-judgmentally. I'll cover the empathy thing in just a minute. And also knowing where to signpost people to as well. I'll cover some additional signposting tools at the back, but that's important because it's recognizing that actually, first and foremost, for someone to want to reach out, for someone to say that they are struggling, for someone to, whether that first port of call is a mental health first aid, or whether it is the employee assistance program, whether it's calling the Lighthouse charity, for someone to make that choice, to recognize that they may have an issue or that they do have an issue, is very difficult. Never underestimate that. Which is why it's so often easier for us to spot signs and problems with ourselves than it is for necessarily, to spot signs and issues in other people than it is necessarily in ourselves. And therefore knowing, how can I reach out? Steve hasn't been himself recently. He's very irritable, he's very anxious. It's just not the normal Steve. But how do I have that conversation with him? I'm not a mental health first aider, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a counselor, I don't know how to do that. But critically, I can do that. I would do that if I felt comfortable, and if I felt my work environment enabled me and empowered me to have that conversation. That's really important. So before we even get to the point where we're reaching out for that helpline, we've got to instill those basics within the workplace so people feel comfortable and know when to reach out. Know when to reach out to a mental health first aider. Know who your mental health first aiders are. And for mental health first aiders to know what the boundaries of that role are as well, and to have an infrastructure around the mental health first aid model. Mental health first aid is an interesting one because it's one of those tertiary interventions which has been, to an extent, over-relied on to some extent, where I think we've seen employers that have focused a bit too much on mental health first aid as a sole or principal support mechanism, rather than a critical part of a wider infrastructure. And therefore that can overburden things like the mental health first aiders. So it's important to build infrastructures around that. That's critical as well. But also make sure we know what all the support services are. So we know that if I'm having that conversation with Steve, I know what my boundaries are because I'm not a mental health first aider, I'm not a counsellor, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do know that I'm a good human being. I do know that I can have a conversation with Steve. Steve, is everything all right? And I do know, because I know a bit more about REAP. I know a bit about the Lighthouse charity. I know a bit about what our mental health first aiders do. So I'm equipped to be able to have that conversation and signpost someone to that next step appropriately. Also think about what listening looks like now. It's different to some extent. If you're still working remotely, We don't have as many visual clues as we did before. Probably not as bad as it might have been, because of course there's so much use of video conferencing. But again, we've got to understand the frame of reference. We've got to avoid assuming anything. Always ask for clarification and check your understanding, and understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is putting yourself in their shoes, and it's understanding and not necessarily having the answer. It's not about, gosh, that's really bad, I'm so sorry to hear that, Steve, that's terrible for you. It's about, gosh, Steve, I really don't know what to say. I feel for you. I don't know what to say, but I'm just so glad you told me right now. People that are in distress don't necessarily always want an answer. What they do want is an outlet, someone they can talk to and feel that they're not being judged in doing so. Okay, just closing off, what can we do to keep well? Some really quick, obvious tips, which I'm sure will probably be relatively familiar to us. Some of these are probably more relevant to earlier on lockdown than they are probably today. But keeping that routine and keeping a structure is critical. Making sure we've got things to do and having projects. Making sure that we're looking out for our own physical well-being and our nutrition. I love this comment, which was made very early on. Gosh, when we go into lockdown, just remember, we're not on holiday. Exercise, keep social connections up, absolutely critical, which is what we're seeing. Back to my previous points, the increased levels of anxiety, we're seeing a lot of that can be driven by lack of control, and of course can be driven through overuse or over-reliance on social media and intake of news. Okay, and just finally, in this current context, I just wanted to add, if we're in that conversation where we find someone that is in crisis, someone that's potentially self-harming, or someone that is suicidal, and we're in a remote or not, we're not with that individual, it's important that we bear these sort of key considerations in mind. You get to a stage where, find out, is there somebody else with that person? If I'm having a conversation with someone and during that conversation, I've asked them, Steve, is everything okay? And we've got to a point where I feel that I need to ask Stephen, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you thinking of taking your own life? And if Stephen then replies and says, yeah, it's on my mind all the time. We need to have that conversation with them. We need to establish, is there someone with them? Is there someone we can get on the line? Can we have a three-way conversation? If not, I think we need to take if you like be over cautious rather than under cautious. Dial 999, and again, try and stay with them on the line until emergency services arrive. Ask them if there's anyone else you want to contact on their behalf. Let HR, let the employer know what's going on as well. And of course, get support yourself. And get your support yourself is important in all contexts. When we think about talking and supporting someone, take stock and think about, how that conversation has impacted you, how it reflects on yourself. That's important. Okay, final slide. Again, there will be copies of the slides shared later separately as well. But again, do familiarize yourself with all the support services which are out there, as well as your own employee assistance program. Think about what your employee assistance program can provide. Not only will it provide 24/7 access to counsellors, but in many cases, there might be access to financial advice, which would be important at the moment. There might be advice for legal advice, for example. But just familiarize yourself with those services, just so when you have that conversation with somebody else that you feel you need to perhaps signpost to that service, you're better equipped to know what professional support's out there. Likewise, familiarize yourself with some of the key free to access services which are out there. The Construction Industry Helpline, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, provides an outstanding and vital lifeline out there for many people, particularly those that don't have access to an employee assistance program. Things like the Hub of Hope, an online app, is really, really beneficial. Gives people access to what local support services are in their area. Of course, Samaritans, SANE, Silverline, OCD UK, the list is endless. There is lots of support out there, but just it's beneficial for us to familiarize ourselves with what's out there so we can have that conversation with someone. And likewise, conversely, we'll know for ourselves should we need to reach out. Thanks, Howard. I'll pass over to you, Howard, if you'd like to facilitate the questions. I'll come out of the screen share.
Well, thank you very much for an extraordinarily comprehensive presentation, which I think you probably answered a lot of the questions because we have a few. I'd like to start by actually a question that's come through the chat line. Do Mates in Mind run online mental health first aid courses? If so, when and how much, and is it accredited?
We run the accredited mental health first aid program. So we do run at the moment, Mental Health First Aid England is running the half-day session, which we can run online in an online context. At the moment, Mental Health First Aid is not running face-to-face sessions. I'm not sure when that will open up, and also I'm not sure what the current guidance is or is going to look like about classroom-based settings, because of course social distancing will have an impact on that. I think off the top of my head, please don't quote me on this, I think the half-day sessions are, I think, somewhere in the region of 600 to 700, and you can include, I believe, up to 16 people on those. The sessions that I referred to earlier were designed specifically to keep no more than 60 to 75 minutes, because of course an online setting is difficult within the current context, and of course within the subject of mental health. So our preference was to keep within an hour, and also make sure we've got trained mental health practitioners and supervisors delivering those courses.
Thanks very much. Next question I have is, what is the government implementing to do with mental well-being during the Covid-19 crisis?
There are quite a few initiatives, there's quite a few initiatives that I'm being made aware of, but not so many that we can discuss right now. But certainly we can point you in a direction post the session. I know the Health and Safety Executive, for example, is about to publish guidance on looking out for the psychological welfare of workers. That hasn't come out just yet.
Okay, I've got another one here. How far should the support go? When does it become too big for the employer to deal with? And what happens next?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? It is one of those length of string questions, isn't it? It's a challenging one. I think the support needs to be measured. It needs to be what is appropriate. Same also, I think, from a physical safety perspective as well. I think that would probably be the simplistic answer to that. A more complex answer, I think we probably need to come back to you on that.
Okay, I mean, it is a difficult question because it leads to another question that I have here is, how can the untrained manager spot anxiety in an employee?
Yeah, I think some of the key skills will be, just having a conversation with the person, taking the time out to have that conversation, and just ask people how they're doing, how they're coping, identify whether there are any differences in behaviours, any differences in their patterns.
Yeah, as the psychologist round here, I would advise that people just look for any behaviour that starts to look abnormal for the individual you know. And the moment you spot that, don't just take one, but perhaps look to 2 or 3 examples, and then consider on an intervention, but be careful on the intervention. You really need to get good support sometimes. Next one I have, do you anticipate an increase in requests for flexible working from home? How should employers approach this? Very good question.
Yeah, I think, again, take a measured approach, but I think almost certainly we're going to see requests for flexible working, because, and I think to an extent, we'll see a percentage of the workplace starting now to work from home on a more regular, if not permanent basis. Would be my gut sense. That wouldn't be based on any solid evidence, but I think in terms of flexible working, particularly as we transition back into the workplace, undoubtedly, I think every request should be taken on its own merit. Every request should be taken seriously. I think you need to make sure there is consistency in how you're approaching it. The CIPD do provide some guidance on that in their return to work guide, which you can download from their webpage. But I definitely think, take a measured, consistent approach to it. But certainly, we're going to see a big increase, and I think they need to be taken very seriously. And of course, that flexibility will be important from a psychological wellbeing perspective.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of bit of action that's going on. The majority of the FTSE 100 companies believe that half of their workforce will, for the next year at least, work flexibly from home. They may do this in terms of shifts or whatever. And you may have seen that Barclays Bank, who have an enormous great investment in Canary Wharf, have decided within 2 years their head office will cease to exist as they move to get people to work more from home or from more regionally to avoid commuting and all those stresses that go with it. So interesting times ahead, I think.
Yeah.
Last question I have is, have any of you, and I think we're talking here to the general people attending, as an employer, subscribe to the Thrive Act? Is it any good, and any comments? I think what we'll do, we'll ask for a show of hands in a minute, but from Mates in Mind, have you looked at the Thrive Act at all, Stephen? Is this something you've seen?
Yeah, I can't endorse products because obviously I'm independent from that perspective. My take on it is, with any health technology, it can play a really important part. The Thrive one is probably one of the better ones I've seen out there, but equally, it's one of those things that it needs to be part of a wider, more joined up program. And just make sure you don't fall into the trap of just introducing that in isolation. Understand, where does that app sit? Where does that piece of text sit within your wider program? What's the purpose of introducing the app? Is it to provide support? Is it to provide the access to the CBT module? Is it for you to capture data on the overall anxiety and depression levels within the workplace? So we just need to take a measured approach to understanding why you're doing it and what you want to get off the back of it, and where, importantly, does it fit within your wider program.
Yes, super. I think what we do is, we've got a number of employees or senior executives from that. Should we just have a show of hands as to how many people have actually had a look at the Thrive app? If you go to your toolbar, you can raise your hands and I'll be able to do a quick count up. We've got about 66 people who've, it's down to 60 now, but it'd be interesting to see how many people have actually had a look at it. Not that many at the moment, it would appear. So it's obviously sort of early in its infancy, but no doubt now that it's gone into the mind of people, that hopefully they will pick it up. I've got one more question at this moment. What would your advice be in a situation where you know an employee has an issue but refuses to admit it or accept it? This rather covers the point I made a few minutes ago, is that you can spot it as a manager, but then you need to be careful on how you do it. So Richard Baldwin has asked us, so what would your advice be from Mates in Mind, Stephen?
Yeah, Richard, it's a very good question, because it's one of those day-to-day scenario situations that we do come across. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, if you've got someone that you are very concerned about, one option could be actually to make an outbound call on their behalf. So Samaritans, for example, will enable you to call them and get them to call someone on your behalf without approaching that individual. So if you're very concerned about them, so the Samaritans essentially would contact said individual and say, someone has contacted us and asked us to get in contact with you because they're concerned about your well-being. How are things? How are you? And that can have a real benefit. I think quite often, we can't force someone. If you feel someone is distressed, is really won't admit they've got an issue, I think it's important just letting them know you're there, and probably just saying to them, if you ever need me, if you ever want to have a chat, I'm always here for you. And that's important because that will set that, that thought process in motion. And quite often that might be the first conversation we have with someone. I may say to Howard, is everything all right? Howard may say, yeah, fine, absolutely fine, leave me alone. But it might be, if Howard genuinely believes that I care about his well-being and has gone away and maybe reflected on what I've said, he might come back and say, actually, things haven't been so great. I've not really had time to digest and think about myself. Actually, I might pick up the phone. I might have that conversation with Steve. So even by setting that is really important.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. The unfortunate thing is that sort of research shows that lots of people leave their organizations because of the issues they have with their first line manager. And some of the sort of effects of well-being relate to some of those. So it can be quite difficult for first line managers to have those conversations because they would be seen as intrusive by the individuals. So, encourage perhaps to speak to someone else, as Stephen says. Very difficult, very difficult. And I think we're going to see it increase. And of course, it's very difficult when you're managing people remotely now. So maintaining regular contact with people, not just through email, but using things like this so you could actually have a stare at someone's face and see if they are behaving or whatever differently. Real challenges ahead. Do we have any more questions? Because we're up to the hour now. I've got the final question is, what is a Mates in Mind 60-minute course available and how much?
The sessions are typically done. We generally do 3 sessions in any given half day, and they are 625 for the 3 sessions essentially. So you could have you could reach about 40 to 50 employees through one half day session. And those half days could also be done over the course of a day. It might be that you have one first thing in the morning and 2 last thing in the afternoon. Or you could run 6 over a full day. And a full day, I believe, is 1, 2, 4, 5.
Okay, well, we've run our course. We have no more sessions through Construction Excellence this week. But we are running one on Thursday, which is a pre-VE Day session. Interestingly, we'll be actually looking at prisoners of war in the Great Escape, where, of course, loss of control, fear, anxiety, freedom are all issues that very much relate to our current times. So please do go online and register for that. I'd like to thank Stephen for his time and for also sharing with us all of his knowledge. So thanks to all of you. And we have an evening session for a bit of fun on Friday night with Boris Johnson. Please go to our site. It's 7 o'clock. Have a bit of fun. We need a bit of a laugh during these times. So many thanks to everyone. And in terms of anything else, I think I'll say, have a great day. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thanks, Howard. Take care.
Bye.